Colorado Territory, 1876. The sky burned orange as the sun descended behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Dust swirled across the valley where Zeke Dawson stood at the corral fence, watching a wild Mustang pace the perimeter. The untamed spirit of the West lived in that horse, the same untamed spirit that had carved this land from wilderness, built towns from nothing, and buried good men beneath 6 feet of unforgiving earth. At 25, Zeke had already learned what most men twice his age understood: the frontier demanded everything and promised nothing. He adjusted his worn Stetson, shielding eyes that had seen too much death for someone so young. His lean frame carried muscle earned from years of breaking horses and driving cattle, while his handsome face remained mostly hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim, just the way he preferred it. "That one's never gonna take a saddle," called Hank, the grizzled ranch foreman. "Best put a bullet in him and be done with it." Zeke shook his head, watching the Mustang's powerful movements. "He just needs time." "Time we ain't got," Hank spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Boss wants all these horses ready for the cattle drive next month." Zeke said nothing, his silence a familiar companion. Words never came easy to him, especially around others. The Double Creek Ranch employed 15 cowhands, yet Zeke remained a mystery to most of them despite 3 years working the same land. They respected his skill with horses and his steady hand during the drives, but few bothered trying to breach the careful distance he maintained. The frontier had taught Zeke early, attachments were dangerous. His parents' homestead raid when he was 14 had driven the lesson home with brutal clarity. In the decade since, he'd built his life around a simple truth: stay alone, stay alive. The frontier was no place for connection. Men who let others get close only created witnesses to their eventual destruction. As twilight deepened across the valley, Zeke made his way toward the bunkhouse. Tomorrow would bring another day of breaking horses, mending fences, and keeping his distance from anything resembling friendship, let alone something more dangerous to his carefully constructed solitude. Little did he know that fate and the next morning's stagecoach would challenge everything he thought he understood about survival in the West. The stagecoach arrived at midday, wheels groaning beneath the weight of passengers and luggage as it rolled into the ranch yard. Zeke barely glanced up from the saddle he was mending until an unfamiliar voice cut through the usual ranch sounds. "Uncle Robert, oh, it's exactly as you described in your letters." Zeke looked up despite himself. Standing beside the coach was a young woman in a traveling dress of deep blue, her blonde hair partially visible beneath a modest hat. She threw her arms around Robert Donovan, the ranch owner, with unrestrained enthusiasm. The old rancher laughed heartily, a sound Zeke hadn't heard in the 2 years since Donovan's wife had passed. "Abigail, my goodness, look at you, no longer the little girl who used to chase fireflies on my visits east." Donovan held his niece at arm's length. "You've grown into quite the young lady." 20 years old now, uncle," she said, her smile bright enough to rival the Colorado sun, "though mother insisted I'd never survive the journey without an escort." "And where is this escort?" "Mrs. Holloway took ill in Denver. The doctor advised her to remain there until recovered." Abigail straightened her shoulders. "I assured her I could manage the final leg of the journey alone." Donovan's face darkened with concern. "Traveling unaccompanied is dangerous, Abigail. These aren't the civilized streets of Philadelphia." "Perhaps, but I've arrived safely, haven't I?" Her confident tone suggested a spirit unsuited for the protected confines of Eastern society. "And I intend to make myself useful during my stay. You'll not find me sitting idly with embroidery all summer." Donovan chuckled, shaking his head. "Your father warned me about your headstrong nature. He should know. I inherited it from his side of the family." She glanced around the ranch yard, her gaze eventually settling on Zeke. For an uncomfortable moment, their eyes met before he quickly returned his attention to the saddle. "Come inside, let's get you settled," Donovan said, guiding her toward the main house. "Cook will have lunch ready soon." Zeke exhaled slowly as they departed. Something about the young woman's arrival disturbed the careful equilibrium of his existence, like the first gust of wind before a storm. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the reliability of leather and stitching beneath his hands. That evening at supper, Donovan made an announcement that sent unease crawling up Zeke's spine. "My niece will be staying with us through the summer and perhaps longer," the rancher told the assembled hands. "Miss Abigail Donovan has expressed interest in learning about ranch operations. I expect you all to treat her with the respect due a lady." The men nodded, some exchanging glances. A young, unmarried woman was a rarity in these parts, especially one with Abigail's refined beauty and Eastern education. "Zeke," Donovan continued, causing him to freeze mid-bite, "Miss Donovan has expressed interest in learning to ride properly. As our best horseman, I'd like you to teach her." The fork in Zeke's hand suddenly felt too heavy. He looked up, meeting Donovan's expectant gaze, then briefly glanced at Abigail. She was watching him with curious blue eyes. "Sir, I'm not sure that's—" "Nonsense," Donovan interrupted. "You broke that Appaloosa last spring gentler than any horse I've seen. If anyone can teach my niece to ride safely, it's you." Trapped by obligation to the man who had given him steady work when others wouldn't take a chance on the quiet, damaged young man he'd been, Zeke could only nod stiffly. "Yes, sir." Abigail's smile widened. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson. I look forward to our lessons." Zeke merely nodded again, already calculating how to fulfill this obligation while maintaining the careful distance that had kept him safe all these years. Teaching a woman to ride was one thing, becoming entangled in her life was another danger entirely. The following morning arrived with painful brightness. Zeke had selected the gentlest mare in the remuda for Abigail's first lesson. He waited by the corral, running through explanations in his mind, rehearsing words that never came naturally. Abigail arrived wearing a practical riding skirt rather than the elaborate Eastern fashion he'd expected. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple braid that caught the morning light. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," she called, approaching with confident strides. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "No, ma'am," he gestured to the chestnut mare. "This is Penny, she'll be your mount." Abigail approached the horse, extending her hand palm up as the mare sniffed curiously. "She's beautiful." "She's calm," Zeke corrected. "Beauty doesn't matter much if she throws you." "A practical perspective," Abigail noted with a slight smile. "Though I believe one can appreciate both utility and beauty simultaneously, don't you think?" Zeke shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose. You don't talk much, do you, Mr. Dawson?" The direct observation caught him off guard. "Not when there's nothing worth saying." To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound without mockery, refreshing honesty. In Philadelphia, people speak endlessly while saying nothing at all. He didn't know how to respond to that, so instead he focused on the task. "Have you ridden before?" "Only side saddle, on gentle paths with grooms leading the horse." She patted Penny's neck. "Nothing like real riding, I imagine." "No, nothing like it," Zeke gestured to the western saddle he prepared. "You'll ride astride, more control that way." If she was scandalized by the suggestion, she didn't show it. Instead, she nodded decisively. "Show me everything, Mr. Dawson. I didn't come west to cling to Eastern proprieties." For the next hour, Zeke demonstrated mounting techniques, proper posture, and basic commands. Abigail proved to be a quick study, listening intently and asking thoughtful questions. When she finally settled into the saddle, her face brightened with undisguised pleasure. "This feels remarkable," she said, testing the reins as he'd shown her. "So different from side saddle, I feel connected to the horse." "That's the idea," Zeke said, adjusting her foot position in the stirrup. "Horse should feel like an extension of yourself." He led her around the corral at a walk, instructing her on subtle weight shifts and rein pressure. To his surprise, she demonstrated natural balance and quick adaptation. By the end of the lesson, she was walking the mare in figure eights without his guidance. "You're a good teacher, Mr. Dawson," she said as he helped her dismount. "Very patient." Zeke shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "You learn quick." "Tomorrow we'll try trotting." The eagerness in her voice was impossible to miss. "If you're not too sore," he cautioned. Her smile faltered slightly. "Will I be?" First time riding astride usually leaves an impression. She laughed again, that unguarded sound that somehow pierced through his carefully constructed walls. "Then I shall bear it stoically, until tomorrow, Mr. Dawson." As she walked away, Zeke found himself watching her retreating figure longer than necessary. He turned his attention back to unsaddling Penny, pushing away the unsettling awareness that Abigail Donovan represented everything he avoided: connection, complication, and the dangerous possibility of caring for someone who, like everyone else, would eventually leave or be taken away. True to his prediction, Abigail appeared the next morning moving somewhat stiffly but determined. She greeted him with the same bright smile, though he noted the slight wince as she mounted. "You could rest today," he offered. "And delay progress? Certainly not." She settled into the saddle, adjusting her posture as he taught her. "Besides, Uncle Robert mentioned that you'll be joining the cattle drive next month. I intend to learn as much as possible before then." The mention of the approaching cattle drive brought reality crashing back. These riding lessons were temporary, a brief disruption to his solitary existence that would soon end. The thought should have brought relief, but instead left an unexpected hollow feeling. Over the next 2 weeks, their morning lessons became a routine. Abigail proved an exceptional student, progressing from walks to trots to cantering around the corral. Zeke found himself speaking more than he had in years, explaining techniques and sharing knowledge accumulated through experience. "How did you learn to ride, Mr. Dawson?" she asked one morning as they walked their horses side by side along a gentle trail, her first venture outside the corral. The question prodded at memories he rarely visited. "My father taught me, had me on a horse before I could walk properly." He must have been a good teacher to produce such an accomplished horseman. Zeke's jaw tightened. He was. Something in his tone must have revealed more than he intended, because Abigail's expression softened. "I've noticed you speak of him in the past tense." For reasons he couldn't explain, Zeke found himself answering, "Comanche raid. Our homestead in Texas. I was 14. "I'm so sorry," her voice carried genuine empathy without the pity he despised. "Both your parents." He nodded once, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "My mother died when I was 12, she offered quietly. "Influenza. It's different, I know, but I understand something of loss." The shared confidence hung between them, creating an unexpected bridge across the careful distance he maintained. For the first time in years, Zeke felt the dangerous pull of connection, the temptation to let someone pass the barriers he'd built. "We should head back," he said abruptly, turning his horse. "Storm clouds coming." Abigail glanced at the clear blue sky but didn't contradict him. As they rode back to the ranch, Zeke silently berated himself for the momentary weakness. Sharing pieces of himself only created vulnerability, and vulnerability on the frontier was just another word for danger. "I believe I'm ready to try jumping," Abigail announced 3 weeks into their lessons. Zeke frowned. "That's advanced riding." "Which I'm prepared for after your excellent instruction." Her confidence had grown alongside her skills. "Unless you don't think I'm capable." The challenge in her voice stirred something in him, admiration mixed with concern. "It's not about capability, it's about safety. Life without risk is hardly worth living, Mr. Dawson." She adjusted her hat, determination evident in the set of her jaw. "Isn't that the spirit of the West? Taking chances, pushing boundaries." "The spirit of the West has killed more people than disease," he countered. "Caution keeps you alive out here." Something in his expression must have betrayed the personal nature of this philosophy, because Abigail's approach softened. "You've lost more than just your parents to this land, haven't you?" The perceptiveness of her question unsettled him. He looked away, focusing on adjusting Penny's bridle. "We all lose things, learning to accept that is part of surviving." "There's a difference between surviving and living," she said quietly. "From what I've observed, Mr. Dawson, you're quite accomplished at the former but perhaps neglect the latter." Her words struck too close to truths he avoided examining. "We'll set up a small jump," he conceded, changing the subject. "Just one and not high." Her smile returned, brightening her entire countenance. "Thank you." As they worked to position a low wooden barrier in the corral, ranch hands passing by called out encouragements to Abigail. In mere weeks, she had charmed the entire crew with her combination of Eastern refinement and surprising frontier adaptability. Even gruff Hank had taken to tipping his hat when she passed. Zeke watched as she prepared Penny for the jump, noting how naturally she now moved around horses, how confidently she gave commands. Pride warmed his chest before he recognized it for the danger it was. Taking credit meant taking ownership of her progress, and ownership meant attachment. Remember, he instructed as she mounted, keep your eyes up, not on the jump. Heels down, back straight, give her enough rein to extend her neck. Abigail nodded, a flash of nervousness crossing her features before determination replaced it. She guided Penny to the far end of the corral, turned, and began a controlled canter toward the jump. In that moment, with the morning sun illuminating her concentrated expression, Zeke was struck by how completely she belonged in this landscape despite her Eastern origins. The realization disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Penny approached the jump confidently, but at the last moment a rattlesnake slithered from beneath the wooden barrier. The horse reared suddenly, panicked by the unexpected threat. Abigail, caught off guard, lost her balance and tumbled backward, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Zeke vaulted the corral fence before she'd even settled in the dirt, heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years. He reached her side as she struggled to sit up, gasping for the breath knocked from her lungs. "Don't move," he ordered, hands hovering uncertainly, "could be hurt inside." She shook her head, still fighting for air. "Just winded." Relief flooded him with such intensity that he nearly swayed. As her breathing steadied, he helped her to a sitting position, one hand supporting her back while the other grasped her arm. Only then did he realize how close they were, how completely he'd abandoned his careful distance in that moment of fear. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked, voice rough with concern. "My pride mostly." She attempted a smile that transformed into a wince, "perhaps my shoulder as well." Several ranch hands had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Zeke waved them back, not wanting to overwhelm her. With gentle movements, he helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "I should try again," she said, looking toward where Hank had calmed Penny. "Isn't that the rule? Fall off, get back on." "Not today," Zeke said firmly. "Doctor should look at that shoulder." For once, she didn't argue. Instead, she leaned slightly against him as they walked toward the ranch house, her usual independence temporarily set aside. The trust implicit in that gesture affected Zeke more deeply than he wanted to admit. That night, alone in the bunkhouse while the other hands played cards, Zeke confronted an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between teaching Abigail to mount properly and watching her fall, his carefully constructed walls had developed dangerous cracks. The panic he'd felt seeing her thrown wasn't the professional concern of a teacher for a student, it was the visceral fear of a man watching harm come to someone he cared about. The realization left him restless and uneasy. Caring was a luxury he denied himself for good reason. Caring made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed on the frontier. He'd witnessed it too many times, good men distracted by worry for loved ones, making fatal mistakes. The cattle drive would start in 2 weeks. Then he'd be gone for nearly a month, plenty of time to rebuild the distance that Abigail Donovan had somehow bridged without his noticing. Plenty of time to remember why he'd chosen solitude in the first place. What he didn't anticipate was how empty that solitude would suddenly feel. The doctor confirmed nothing was broken, merely bruised, but recommended Abigail rest for several days before resuming riding. To Zeke's surprise, she appeared at the corral the very next morning, arm in a sling but determination unchanged. "Before you object," she said as he opened his mouth to protest, "I've no intention of riding today. I simply thought I might observe and learn." Skepticism must have shown on his face because she continued with a hint of amusement. "I promise to remain firmly on the ground, Mr. Dawson." "Doctor's orders." He relented with a nod, returning to the Mustang he'd been working with, the same wild-eyed stallion Hank had suggested shooting. Over the past weeks, Zeke had made slow progress with the animal, graduating from simply being in the same corral to brief touches along its flank. Abigail watched from the fence as Zeke moved in slow, deliberate patterns around the nervous horse. "You have remarkable patience," she observed after nearly 20 minutes of silence. Most men would have broken him by force by now. Zeke shrugged. "Force just creates fear. Fear makes horses dangerous." "Is that true of people as well?" The question held no judgment, merely curiosity. He paused, considering. People are complicated. Indeed they are, she adjusted her position against the fence. Though I've observed that you approach them much as you do this Mustang, with caution and distance, waiting for them to make the first move. Her perceptiveness was unsettling. Zeke focused on the Mustang rather than responding directly. Some distances are necessary. Perhaps, she acknowledged, though I wonder if what begins as necessary can become habitual, persisting even when the original danger has passed. The Mustang snorted and shifted away, sensing Zeke's discomfort. He forced himself to relax, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. You lost your family young, Abigail continued softly. That would teach anyone to be cautious with attachments. Zeke stiffened. Miss Donovan. Abigail, please. After a month of daily lessons, I think we might dispense with formalities. Miss Donovan, he repeated firmly, my past isn't a subject for discussion. She accepted the rebuke with a graceful nod. My apologies. Curiosity is both my greatest strength and most persistent flaw, according to my father. The mention of her father reminded Zeke of his proper place. She was the ranch owner's niece, educated and refined despite her interest in frontier life. He was a hired hand with nothing to offer but his skills and labor. Any other consideration was foolish at best, dangerous at worst. Will you still join the cattle drive? She asked, changing the subject. Yes. Despite my incomplete education. Mr. Donovan hired Jensen to continue your lessons. The words tasted bitter somehow, though he had no right to such feelings. Ah, she said, a note of disappointment evident. Mr. Jensen is certainly competent, though his teaching style lacks your patience. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the Mustang's movements and distant sounds of ranch activity. Abigail finally pushed away from the fence. I should let you work in peace. Thank you for allowing me to observe. As she walked away, Zeke felt the strange dual relief and regret that had become commonplace in her presence. Relief at returning to the solitude he understood, regret at the loss of something he couldn't name but increasingly valued. The Mustang approached cautiously, finally allowing Zeke to run his hand along its neck, a breakthrough that should have brought satisfaction. Instead, he found himself glancing toward the main house, where Abigail had disappeared from view. The week before the cattle drive brought a flurry of activity to Double Creek Ranch. Supplies were prepared, horses selected, and final arrangements made for the long journey to the railhead in Cheyenne. Amidst the preparations, Zeke's riding lessons with Abigail continued, though with increased caution following her fall. On their final lesson before his departure, they rode along the creek that gave the ranch its name. Summer had fully arrived, painting the valley in vibrant greens and wildflower hues. Abigail had progressed to controlling her mount with confidence, her posture natural and relaxed. I shall miss our lessons, she said as they stopped to water the horses. A month seems quite long when measured against the progress we've made. Zeke nodded, unsure how to express his own complicated feelings about the separation. Jensen will keep you improving. It's not the same, she dismounted gracefully, leading her horse to the creek's edge. You understand horses in a way few people do. You speak their language. Easier than people, he admitted, surprising himself with the candor. Abigail smiled, the expression softening her already lovely features. Yet you've become quite conversational these past weeks. I count at least 3 instances today where you spoke without being directly questioned. The gentle teasing might once have caused him to retreat into silence. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself smiling in return. Must be losing my touch. Her laughter rippled like the creek water. A dangerous development indeed. Soon you'll be engaging in voluntary conversation with the entire ranch. Let's not get carried away. She sobered slightly, though her eyes remained warm. In seriousness, I want to thank you, Zeke. You've taught me more than just riding. The use of his first name created an intimacy that should have alarmed him. Instead, he found himself savoring the sound of it on her lips. What else? He asked. Patience, observation, the value of earned trust rather than demanded compliance. She gazed across the valley. This land requires a different approach than Philadelphia society. You can't simply expect things to bend to your will because of who you are or what you possess. The insight impressed him. Many Easterners never grasped that fundamental truth about the frontier. Most don't learn that lesson until it's taught the hard way, he said. I had an excellent teacher who prevented the hard lesson. Her smile returned, a brightness that seemed to reach inside him and warm places long cold. The danger of this moment, of this growing connection, suddenly pressed upon him with renewed clarity. In a week, he would ride out with the herd. A month on the trail would provide the distance needed to regain perspective, to remember why attachments were liabilities he couldn't afford. We should head back, he said, more abruptly than intended. Something in his tone or expression must have revealed his retreat, because Abigail's smile faltered. She mounted without assistance, her movements displaying the confidence she'd developed under his tutelage. They rode back in silence, the easy camaraderie of earlier replaced by a tension Zeke couldn't name but recognized as his own creation. At the corral, he helped her dismount out of habit, his hands at her waist lifting her down. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that he could detect the faint lavender scent she wore. "I wish you safe travels," she said, stepping back. "The trail can be dangerous." "Done it before." She nodded, a shadow crossing her expression. "Of course. Well, goodbye then, Mr. Dawson. Thank you again for your instruction." The return to formality stung more than he expected. As she walked away, Zeke felt the weight of words unspoken, things he had no right to say and couldn't afford to feel. Better this way, he told himself. Better to rebuild the walls before they crumbled completely. That night, as the ranch hands celebrated the eve of the cattle drive with whiskey and card games, Zeke sat alone on the bunkhouse porch. The main house windows glowed warm in the distance, and he found himself wondering what Abigail was doing, if she was reading one of the books she often mentioned, or writing letters to her father in Philadelphia, or perhaps thinking of their final ride together. "Mighty interesting view," came Hank's gravelly voice as the foreman settled beside him with a grunt. "That big empty space between here and the main house." Zeke said nothing, taking a slow draw on his cigarette. "Known you 3 years, boy. Never seen you look at anything like you look at that girl. Don't know what you're talking about." Hank snorted. "Course not, just like you ain't been talking more these past weeks than in the 3 years before." Zeke shifted uncomfortably. "Drive leaves at dawn, should get some sleep." "Running away won't fix what ails you," Hank said, his usual gruffness softened by something like concern. "Trust me on that. Spent 15 years trying." Before Zeke could respond, the foreman stood with another grunt. "Night, boy, see you at first light." Alone again, Zeke gazed at the distant house until its lights went dark, then at the stars wheeling overhead in the vast Colorado sky. The frontier had taught him that survival meant isolation, that attachment was weakness. But for the first time in a decade, he found himself questioning whether survival alone was enough. The cattle drive departed at dawn as planned, dust rising beneath the hooves of nearly 2,000 head of cattle. Zeke rode drag position, eating dust at the rear of the herd where the least experienced hands were typically placed. He suspected Donovan had assigned him there deliberately, keeping him away from the front where the owner himself rode. The first week passed in the familiar rhythm of the trail, long days in the saddle, short nights of exhausted sleep, constant vigilance against stampedes or strays. The physical demands left little energy for reflection, which suited Zeke perfectly. When unwanted thoughts of Abigail surfaced, he pushed them aside by volunteering for extra watches or focusing on breaking the Mustang he'd brought along, the same wild stallion that had finally accepted a saddle just days before departure. On the 8th night, camped along the North Platte River, everything changed. Zeke had just finished his watch shift when riders approached from the north, 3 men leading packhorses laden with supplies. The drive's cook greeted them as they rode into the firelight. "Got those provisions from Laramie right on schedule," the lead rider announced, dismounting with a groan, "though we had to ride like hell to catch up to you boys." "Any news from town?" Donovan asked as the men settled by the fire. "Plenty," the rider said, accepting a tin cup of coffee. "Stage got held up about 20 miles south of the ranch few days after you left. Messy business." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crawled up Zeke's spine. "Casualties?" Donovan asked sharply. "Driver and guard both shot dead, passengers roughed up but alive from what we heard." The rider took a long swallow of coffee. except one man put up a fight, got himself killed. Some Easterner visiting relatives out this way. Any description of the bandits? The foreman asked. Talk as it might be the Blackwell gang. They've been working that route past few months. Zeke barely heard the rest of the conversation. His mind raced with images of the stagecoach route that passed near Double Creek Ranch, the same route Abigail would take when she eventually returned east. The thought of her encountering men like the Blackwells hollowed him out with a fear more profound than any he'd felt for himself. When the camp finally quieted, Zeke approached Donovan, who sat alone by the dying fire. "Mr. Donovan." The rancher looked up, surprise evident at being addressed directly by his most reticent hand. "Dawson, something wrong." "Request permission to return to the ranch," Zeke said, the words emerging with difficulty. "Concerned about security there with the stage robberies so close." Donovan studied him for a long moment. "Concerned about the ranch or about my niece?" The direct question caught Zeke off guard. He struggled to maintain his composure. "Both, sir." A faint smile touched the older man's weathered face. "Abigail has that effect on people, makes them care when they'd rather not." Zeke said nothing, unwilling to confirm what was apparently obvious to others. "Jensen and 5 hands remain behind," Donovan continued. "The ranch is well protected." "The Blackwell gang runs 8 men, sometimes more," Zeke countered, "if they've hit that close." "You care for her, it wasn't a question." Zeke stared into the embers, confronting a truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Doesn't matter what I feel, matters that she's safe." "It matters more than you think," Donovan sighed heavily. "My wife used to say that love and fear were opposing forces, that you couldn't truly love while living in fear." "Sir, I'm not." "Don't waste breath denying what's plain as day, son." The rancher tossed a stick into the dying fire. "Take Morgan and Davis with you, ride at first light." Relief and apprehension warred within him. "Thank you, sir." As he turned to go, Donovan called after him softly, "Zeke." He paused, unused to hearing his first name from the rancher. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever's kept you isolated all these years, ask yourself if it's worth the cost." The words followed Zeke to his bedroll, where sleep proved elusive despite his exhaustion. By first light, he had made peace with a truth that terrified him more than any physical danger. Somewhere between teaching Abigail Donovan to mount a horse and watching her confidence bloom, he had fallen in love with her. The question now was whether he had the courage to face that love, or if fear would continue to dictate his choices as it had for the past decade. The 3-day ride back to Double Creek Ranch passed in a blur of urgency. Zeke pushed himself and his companions hard, stopping only when the horses required rest. The closer they drew to the ranch, the more his anxiety grew, not just for Abigail's safety, but for the confrontation with feelings he'd spent years avoiding. They arrived at midday, horses lathered from the final push across the valley. Zeke's eyes went immediately to the main house, searching for any sign of disturbance. Everything appeared normal, with hands going about their usual tasks and smoke rising steadily from the kitchen chimney. Jensen approached as they dismounted in the yard. "Dawson, what are you doing back so soon? Something happened to the herd." "Stage robberies nearby," Zeke explained tersely. "Donovan sent us back as precaution." Relief loosened the tension in his shoulders, but only briefly. Now that immediate danger seemed absent, he faced a different challenge: what to say to Abigail and how to explain his return. As if conjured by his thoughts, she appeared on the main house porch, a book in hand. She wore a simple day dress of pale yellow, her blonde hair braided and draped over one shoulder. Even at a distance, he could see her expression shift from surprise to something he couldn't name as she recognized him. She descended the porch steps and crossed the yard with measured strides, composure perfect despite what must have been unexpected shock at his appearance. "Mr. Dawson," she greeted him, her voice carefully neutral. "This is a surprise. Is my uncle well?" "Yes, ma'am, he's fine." Zeke removed his hat, suddenly acutely aware of his trail-worn appearance and the dust coating his clothes. "He sent us back as a precaution. Stage robberies reported nearby." "How considerate of him to think of our safety," she said, though her tone suggested she doubted this explanation. "Though I'm surprised he would spare men from the drive for such a purpose." Before he could respond, Jensen interjected, "We've had no trouble here, been quiet as a church on Monday." "Nevertheless," Zeke said, "we'll stay until the drive returns." Abigail studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his face as though looking for answers to unspoken questions. "Well, you must be exhausted from your journey. I'll have cook prepare something for you and your companions." With that, she turned and walked back toward the house, her posture betraying none of her thoughts. "She's been riding every day," Jensen offered unexpectedly. "Getting quite good, mentioned your teaching more than once." The information shouldn't have pleased him as much as it did. Zeke handed his reins to Morgan, going to check the perimeter. "Make sure everything's secure." The circuit around the ranch property provided time to gather his thoughts and plan his approach. Donovan's words from the trail echoed in his mind. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever's kept you isolated all these years, ask yourself if it's worth the cost." For 10 years he'd lived by a simple creed: attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed. But riding back to Double Creek at breakneck pace, he'd realized a deeper truth: that fear of loss had already cost him a decade of truly living. That evening, after washing away the trail dust and changing into clean clothes, Zeke walked to the main house. The sun had just set, painting the western sky in vibrant oranges and purples. Abigail sat alone on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. She watched his approach without expression. "Mr. Dawson." "Miss Donovan," he stopped at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Would you care to join me?" She gestured to the empty chair beside her. He climbed the steps and sat, the unfamiliar setting making him acutely aware of crossing a boundary, from employee to something undefined. "It wasn't your uncle's idea for you to return, was it?" she asked directly after a moment of silence. Zeke considered lying, then discarded the notion. He approved it, wasn't his suggestion. "I see," she turned slightly to face him. "And why did you request to return?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. "Was worried." "About you?" "About my safety or about my writing progress?" A hint of amusement colored her tone. "Both." He paused, searching for words that didn't come easily, mostly the first. She studied him in the fading light. "You rode 3 days at punishing pace because you were concerned about a stage robbery that might never affect this ranch." Put that way, his actions seemed either foolish or revealing, perhaps both. "Yes." "Why?" The simple question demanded a complicated answer, one that required him to articulate feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself. "Because the thought of harm coming to you," he stopped, swallowed hard. "It wasn't something I could live with." The admission hung between them, more revealing than any declaration of feeling might have been. Abigail's expression softened, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "You've spent years avoiding attachments," she said quietly. "I've heard the stories from the hands, the quiet cowboy who keeps to himself, who never visits town, who volunteers for solitary tasks." He nodded, unable to deny the truth of her assessment. "What changed?" "Everything," he thought. "You changed everything." "I did," he said simply. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his, a gesture so unexpected that he nearly pulled away from habit. Instead, he turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. "I'm glad you came back," she whispered. In that moment, with her hand in his and the last light fading from the Colorado sky, Zeke realized that some risks were worth taking, that some connections were worth the vulnerability they created. The frontier might be unforgiving, but facing it alone was a choice, not a necessity. The Blackwell gang struck 3 days later. They came at dawn, 8 riders emerging from the morning mist like specters. Zeke spotted them from the bunkhouse porch where he'd taken to watching the sunrise, thinking of Abigail and the quiet conversation they'd shared each evening since his return. "Riders coming," he shouted, grabbing his Winchester from inside the door. 8 men armed. The warning sent the ranch into immediate activity. Hands grabbed weapons and took positions as the riders approached at a measured pace, too confident for simple travelers, too deliberate for innocent visitors. Zeke positioned himself near the main house where Abigail would be. Jensen and 2 others flanked him, while the remaining hands spread out around the barn and corral. The riders stopped just beyond easy rifle range. Their leader, a tall man with a dramatic black beard, called out, "We're looking for Robert Donovan." "He's not here," Jensen shouted back, riding herd to Cheyenne. The bearded man conferred briefly with his companions. "Then we'll deal with whoever's in charge. We're taking your horses and whatever cash you've got on hand." "This property is defended," Jensen responded. "Suggest you move along before things get unpleasant." A cold laugh carried across the yard. Unpleasant is what happens when people don't cooperate with Emmett Blackwell. The confirmation of the gang's identity sent a chill through Zeke. These were the same men responsible for the stage robbery, killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The front door opened behind him, and Abigail emerged despite his warning to stay inside. "Miss Donovan, get back." "Are you Emmett Blackwell?" she called out, her voice remarkably steady. The bearded man straightened in his saddle. "I am, and who might you be, lovely lady?" "Abigail Donovan. This is my uncle's ranch, and you are not welcome here." Blackwell's laugh boomed across the yard. "Well now, isn't that something? A woman telling Emmett Blackwell where he's not welcome." He turned to his men. "Boys, I think we just found our leverage." The implication sent rage coursing through Zeke. He moved in front of Abigail, rifle raised. "You won't touch her." "Stand aside, cowboy," Blackwell called. "We're not here for a massacre unless you force our hand. The lady comes with us, the rest of you live. We'll release her once Donovan pays what we ask." "Not happening," Zeke said, voice deadly calm despite the fear churning inside him. He felt Abigail's hand on his arm. "Zeke," she said quietly, "there are 8 of them." "Don't matter," his eyes never left Blackwell. "They're not taking you." "No one needs to die today," Blackwell shouted. "But we're not leaving empty-handed. You've got 1 minute to send the woman out, or we start shooting." Time seemed to slow as Zeke assessed their options. The ranch hands were outnumbered, though they had the advantage of cover. A gunfight would mean casualties on both sides, and risking Abigail in the crossfire was unthinkable. "I have a counteroffer," Zeke called. "You leave now, you get to keep breathing." Blackwell's face darkened. "Time's up." What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence. The outlaws spread out, preparing to charge the ranch buildings. Zeke pushed Abigail toward the door. "Inside." "Now." For once, she didn't argue, disappearing into the house as the first shots rang out. Zeke took cover behind a water barrel, squeezing off careful shots at the advancing riders. 2 fell immediately, while a third clutched his arm but remained mounted. The air filled with gunsmoke and the thunder of hooves as the remaining outlaws charged. Zeke reloaded mechanically, years of practice guiding his movements even as fear for Abigail threatened to overwhelm his focus. A bullet splintered the barrel beside him, another tore through his sleeve. Jensen cried out as he took a hit, collapsing behind the woodpile where he'd taken position. Another ranch hand fell near the barn, his rifle clattering to the dirt. Through the chaos, Zeke spotted Blackwell dismounting behind a trough, working his way toward the main house. With cold clarity, he understood the outlaw's intention, to capture Abigail regardless of the outcome of the gunfight. Abandoning his cover, Zeke sprinted toward the house, bullets kicking up dust at his heels. He rounded the corner just as Blackwell reached the back door, catching the outlaw by surprise. Both men fired simultaneously. Zeke felt the burn of a bullet grazing his side but kept moving forward as Blackwell staggered, blood blossoming on his chest. The outlaw raised his pistol for another shot. Zeke fired again, this time watching Blackwell collapse against the porch steps, his weapon falling from lifeless fingers. The sudden absence of gunfire was jarring after the cacophony of battle. Zeke approached cautiously, confirming Blackwell was dead before rushing into the house. Abigail. She emerged from the pantry where she'd taken shelter, a small derringer clutched in her trembling hand. The sight of him brought visible relief to her face, quickly replaced by alarm. "You're bleeding." He glanced down at the darkening stain on his shirt, just a graze. She crossed to him quickly, setting aside the derringer to examine his wound with gentle fingers. "This needs attention." "Others first," he insisted. "Jensen's hit worse." The aftermath of the gunfight revealed the cost. 3 outlaws dead, including Blackwell, the rest fled. On the ranch side, 1 hand killed, 3 wounded including Jensen, whose shoulder would likely never work properly again. As Abigail helped the ranch wife tend to the wounded, Zeke organized the remaining hands to secure the property against any potential return by the surviving gang members. Only when everything was settled did he allow Abigail to clean and bandage his side, her touch both professional and tender. "You could have been killed," she said softly as she worked, her hands steady despite the emotion in her voice. "Couldn't let them take you." The simplicity of his response belied the complexity of what he'd realized during those desperate moments, that losing her would be worse than any physical pain or death he might suffer. She finished securing the bandage, then placed her palm against his chest over his heart. "I was terrified, not for myself but at the thought of losing you." The admission struck him with force. For years he'd believed that caring made you vulnerable, that love was a liability in a dangerous world. What he hadn't understood until facing Blackwell's gang was that love could also be a source of courage, that having something worth fighting for made you stronger, not weaker. "I love you," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "Should have said it before now." Her eyes widened, then filled with a warmth that chased away the last shadows of the morning's violence. "I love you too, Zeke. I think I have since you first taught me that patience matters more than force." He drew her gently into his arms, mindful of his injury, and kissed her with all the feeling he'd kept contained for weeks. She responded with equal passion, her fingers curling into his shirt as though anchoring herself to him. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Reckon this means I failed at keeping my distance." Her laughter, soft and intimate, washed over him. "Spectacularly so, Mr. Dawson, spectacularly so." Robert Donovan returned with the cattle drive 2 weeks later to find his ranch transformed in unexpected ways. The attempted raid had been repelled, the surviving Blackwell gang members captured by a U.S. Marshal who'd been tracking them for months. The bodies of the fallen outlaws were long buried, and repairs to bullet-damaged structures nearly complete. But the most significant change awaited him in the main house, where he found his niece and his most reticent ranch hand seated side by side on the sofa, fingers intertwined as they explained their intentions. "Marriage," Donovan repeated, his bushy eyebrows rising toward his hairline, "after less than 3 months' acquaintance." "When you know, uncle, you know," Abigail said with quiet confidence. The events with the Blackwell gang merely confirmed what we'd already discovered. Donovan turned his attention to Zeke. "And what of your plans, Dawson? A ranch hand's salary won't support a wife from Eastern society." "Don't intend to remain just a hand, sir." Zeke met his employer's gaze steadily. "Been saving these past years, enough for a small spread of my own. With your blessing, I'd like to build something worthy of Abigail." The older man's expression softened. "You already proved yourself worthy when you rode back to protect her, and again when you faced down Blackwell's gang." He rose from his chair and crossed to the cabinet where he kept important papers, withdrawing a folded document. "I had intended this as a wedding gift whenever Abigail eventually married. Seems the occasion has arrived sooner than expected." He handed the paper to Zeke, who opened it with confusion that quickly turned to shock. "This is a deed for the North Valley property." 2,000 acres, Donovan confirmed. "Good water rights, excellent grazing, needs a proper house built, but the old line cabin will serve until then." Abigail gasped. "Uncle Robert, that's incredibly generous." "It's practical," he corrected, though his eyes twinkled. "Keeps you close enough to visit but far enough for independence. Besides, I'm not getting any younger. Having family nearby to eventually take over Double Creek brings me comfort." Zeke stared at the deed, overwhelmed by its significance. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll make her happy," Donovan replied simply. "And that you'll finally accept that some things are worth the risk of caring." The wedding took place that autumn, when the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold. The ceremony in the small church in town was attended by the entire Double Creek crew, neighboring ranchers, and Abigail's father, who traveled from Philadelphia with reluctant blessing for the union his daughter had described in passionate letters. As Zeke waited at the altar, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in a single summer. The walls he'd built after his parents' death had crumbled beneath Abigail's patient attention, much as the wild Mustang, now his faithful mount, had eventually accepted his gentle training. When she appeared at the church entrance on her father's arm, her blonde hair crowned with wildflowers and her white dress catching the light streaming through stained glass windows, Zeke felt a certainty that transcended the fear that had defined his existence for so long. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound. Abigail spoke of finding unexpected belonging in the western landscape and in Zeke's quiet strength. He promised to cherish her spirit and courage, to build a life worthy of the joy she'd brought into his world. "I came west to learn riding," she whispered as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "I never expected to find home instead." "And I never expected teaching riding to change everything," he replied, holding her close as the fiddles played. "Turns out some lessons work both ways." Their new home in the North Valley took shape through the winter, a sturdy ranch house built by hands that had learned that creating something lasting required vulnerability and trust. By spring, when the wildflowers again carpeted the valley floor, the Zbardi Ranch had established itself as a promising new venture, with a small herd of quality horses and cattle bearing their brand. On warm evenings, they would often ride together to the highest point on their property, where the entire valley spread before them in breathtaking beauty. There, with the setting sun painting the Rockies in amber light, they would reminisce about riding lessons that had become life lessons, about patience and trust, about the courage to remain open in a world that encouraged walls and distance. "Do you ever regret it?" Abigail asked once as they watched the stars emerge above their land. "Opening your heart after keeping it closed for so long?" Zeke considered the decade he'd spent in emotional isolation, then looked at the woman beside him, the one who had taught him that true strength came not from avoiding attachment but from finding something worth the risk of loving. "Only regret is waiting so long to start living," he said, drawing her into his embrace. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others." As they rode home in the gathering darkness, the lights of their ranch house glowing in the distance like a beacon, Zeke Dawson finally understood what had eluded him for so many years. That the frontier's greatest challenge wasn't merely surviving its harshness, but finding the courage to build something beautiful despite it. A home, a family, a love that transformed mere existence into a life truly worth living.